there, I think perhaps was always going to be some kind of major consequence of the fact that that happened almost bloodlessly, not completely bloodlessly. There were various coups where hundreds of people were killed, but not thousands. But this did not have to happen. And one of the seeds that I'm trying to plant in the conclusion of this book is the responsibility that in the West perhaps we bear through having supported so many of the oligarchs, having washed their money through London, through having taken political donations from them. And in many ways that enabled Putin's regime.
Now, let's take a trip back in time to 1993, where a young British student found herself trying to understand a world that just ceased to exist. The Soviet Union. Journalist and comedian Viv Groskop did a study year abroad in the former USSR, where an ambitious young politician named Vladimir Putin was rising through the ranks, and many in the West were completely unaware that Ukraine, or indeed any of the former Soviet bloc states, were their own countries with distinct cultures, languages, and histories. Well, she's written a book about her fascinating year in St. Petersburg and Krivoy, and in her book, One Ukrainian Summer, she joins me now to talk about it. Viv, thank you so much for coming in. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Look, the book is so fascinating, but we were talking about this during the news. I was asking you what on earth possessed you to go, but of course, 1993, we were thinking about Russia in a completely different mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm of the generation, I'm 50, I'm going to turn 51 this summer. This was the summer I turned 21 in 1994 was the summer that I spent in Ukraine. And the previous year, I'd spent the whole year in St. Petersburg, where I met all these Ukrainians, and I ended up having this Ukrainian boyfriend who was in a band, who thought they were Ukraine's answer to the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Nice.
And I was really from that generation who'd grown up with Chernobyl happening in 1986, with Gorbachev always on the news, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which was when I was 16. So when I was deciding where to go to university, it just seemed like the most amazing thing to be able to do, to be able to study Russian and to have the chance to go to the former Soviet Union and live there for a year. And I feel as if there are so many people in that generation for whom that was the first place you travelled alone as an adult, where you got a chance to just do your own thing. And it was completely magical because you were always meeting people who had never, ever met a foreigner before in their life and never thought that they would. You know, there was this very short period really between 1991, which is the fall of the Soviet Union, and the beginning of these independent states, of which Ukraine was one of the first. From that moment to about 1994, 1995, after that, things start to become much more cynical. But in that very early 90s period, it was a real time of naivety and on our part and on the part of all of the former Soviet citizens, of this meeting of cultures where the Iron Curtain is suddenly no more.
Well, and also what's fascinating in your book, you know, this complete lack of understanding that the Soviet Union was exactly what it said on the tin. It was a union. There were separate countries with different languages, different culture. I mean, we're very used to right now looking at Ukraine and going, well, it's not part of Russia at all. But how did you sort of discover that when you went to visit?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think in some ways, 30 years later, we in Britain and lots of countries in the West, we're still catching up with this idea. So when I travelled out there, I was studying Russian. I was at Cambridge University. I was a very swotty linguist. But I had no idea that Ukraine existed as its own language. I knew very little about Ukraine as a country. And when I was making friends with all of the kids of my own age in St. Petersburg, I was trying to figure out, okay, so these guys speak Russian, but they also seem to say some other words that I don't understand. And that's Ukrainian. Oh, right. That's a totally different language. But at the same time, they didn't have a strong awareness of their own identity then.
Right.
You know, obviously there were Ukrainians who'd been campaigning for independence for decades during the Soviet period, but they would have been suppressed. That movement only really starts with Chernobyl in the mid-'80s, which became a huge turning away for Moscow and people really realising that Ukraine was going to be left on its own in the wake of such a disaster. So it's very rare to meet people who would have that awareness of Ukrainian independence that now seems so natural to us.
Yeah.
And for me, I really was amazed to see how ignorant we were, you know, to understand that all of these cultures and countries were so different. You know, in countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're the first to seek independence. They're now part of the EU. They'd always had an extremely strong detachment from Moscow. And so often I would meet people when I was living in St. Petersburg who would assume that I was Lithuanian because they'd never met anybody who was from further away than that.
Right.
But it's really interesting to me looking at it now, and what I've tried to do in the book is reflect that tension that you have between what you're like when you're young and kind of a bit stupid and what you're like 30 years on looking back.
Let's go with naive.
Naive, yeah, also stupid. I did some very stupid things like we all did when we were 21. And trying to work out what we perhaps could have seen then and how we perhaps could have seen that and how in some ways... the word brainwashing is a strong word, but I think it's fair enough to use it in the context of Soviet communism. And it's certainly, relevant for the propaganda that exists in Russia now. We in the West as well were sort of brainwashed by this idea of Russian Soviet culture. And don't worry about all these other republics. Their identities don't really matter.
Yeah.
We're all just part of the same thing.
You mentioned in your book that people were reluctant to talk politics with you and were sort of almost getting quite annoyed with you asking sort of questions. And also, you mentioned this famous poem from Russian poet, 19th century, says, "You cannot understand Russia with your mind, nor measure Russia by an average standard. Russia has a special kind of status. You just have to believe in it."
Yeah, this is a famous poem by a poet called Tyutchev from the middle of the 19th century.
But it's sort of very...
Umom России не понять. You cannot understand Russia using your mind.
Right.
It's a very disturbing poem.
It is, because it's sort of like, forget about what you... Well, it's Orwellian in a sense, and I use that cautiously. Don't believe your eyes and ears. You just need to believe in it.
Yeah, well, this is another aspect of Soviet/Russian culture that permeated our understanding, is this idea of the mysterious Russian soul and that famous Churchill phrase of, a mystery wrapped inside an enigma, and this idea that it's so mysterious and so hard to understand, and it's fateful, and it must speak to your soul as you listen to the wind in the birch forest.
It's all very convenient for politicians, of
well,
course.
Exactly. And again, what I've tried to do in conjuring up that time, and I wanted to capture an idea of a time machine in this book where you're transported back to that time, and you don't know what's coming in the future. You don't know that someone like, at the time when Putin came to power, which was in 1999, no one knew that he was going to turn out to be what he has. That has really taken 25 years to unfold. But I wanted to take people back to that time where we didn't think that any of this would happen. Russians and Ukrainians didn't think that any of this would happen. And why was it that we didn't see this coming?
Do you think the signs were there?
There are some people who believe that this is the consequence of the almost peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And in some ways, when you think back, this kind of evil empire who were our enemies for decades just suddenly implodes from within, with no huge revolution, with no huge war. It is extremely weird.
But with a lot of people making a lot of money.
Absolutely. And there, I think, perhaps was always going to be some kind of major consequence of the fact that that happened almost bloodlessly, not completely bloodlessly. There were various coups where hundreds of people were killed, but not thousands. But this did not have to happen. And one of the seeds that I'm trying to plant in the conclusion of this book is the responsibility that in the West, perhaps, we bear through having supported so many of the oligarchs, having washed their money through London, through having taken political donations from them. And in many ways, that enabled Putin's regime.
Listen, it's a fascinating read and a wonderful read. Before we go, what happened to Ukrainians' answer to the Red Hot Chili Peppers? Did they make it, Viv?
Unfortunately, Ukraine's answer to the Red Hot Chili Peppers put the fate of post-Soviet punk rock in my hands.
Oh, no.
And I attempted to, I did tape-to-tape reels of their shows and sent them to British record companies, and response came there none.
I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that.
Remembering their music, I think it's a blessing for us all.
You've saved us all. Viv, it's a great book. Thank you so much for coming in and telling us about it. It's a really a wonderful read, and also just a time that I think now, you and I are the same age. I was saying in the break how at the drama school where I was, there was an exchange program with Russian drama students in Moscow. And of course, that's unthinkable now. Perhaps that culture now is we're gonna have to wait a long time before it sort of comes back and is accessible to the rest of us. Viv, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Viv Groskop. The book is called One Ukrainian Summer, a memoir about falling in love and coming of age in the former USSR.